Okay, thank you very much again for this new lecture. And the purpose in this one is to try to summarize some other lines of criticisms around this Cambridge controversy and what implication they bore on the neoclassical theory and the different theoretical and methodological developments that this neoclassical approach eventually managed to transform itself. This theoretical and methodological transformation will regard the key elements of the theory, such as capital, issues of expectations, and of course the notion of equilibrium that the theory attempts to determine by these forces of supply and demand and supply and demand models, etc. Okay, so let's move on. This is more or less the overview I would like to talk about. So first, I will introduce very, very briefly, decades of economic theory around two authors, Wicksell and Walras, and I will try to tell you something about what they share and what they differ on, and why there is a problem of capital for the neoclassical theory. Okay, why it is that the very building of the neoclassical theory has to somehow sort out this problem of capital. Then I will review what these controversies around capital theory between Cambridge in the 1950s and 60s were about, and trying to summarize very, very briefly the most important implications and consequences on the neoclassical theory. And out of this controversy, we will try to go through the sort of responses from the neoclassical side at that time, more or less in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and how was it that the orthodox approach, neoclassical approach, transformed itself into this new neo-variation approach or neo-variation models of intertemporal and temporary general equilibrium, developed by Arrow, Debreu, Hicks, Bliss, and many other authors in the second half of the 20th century. In that connection, I will basically define or point to some methodological problems, where they stand today, and if we have or not new perspectives in the neoclassical theory out of all this transformation. I would say the theory underwent a radical transformation, a radical change when you compare the meaning of the traditional methodology of equilibrium that the founding fathers of the neoclassical theory had developed at that time, with the meaning attached to the equilibrium that we found today in these neo-variation models and this intersection of the Marshallian supply and demand curves, which we find in any microeconomics or macroeconomics textbook, right? So what is the meaning of that point that we plot on the diagram between this intersection of the seesaw supply and demand? That's an interesting thing, I think, because this is the first cup of milk that the economics student will drink when she or he starts their economics studies. And then, yes, it is everything supply and demand and equilibrium, but what is behind this equilibrium, how equilibrium is brought about, how the forces of supply and demand play around in order to achieve that situation, right? Anyway, there are a lot of methodological and epistemological stuff that we can further discuss, because there are a lot of connections of these theoretical development of equilibrium, this idea of mechanistic equilibration or equilibrating forces, which after that were, let's say, exported to other realms of the social sciences, right? Sociology or political science, even, not to mention empirical work in the economic history, right? Anyway, let's move on and let's have the discussion, the last part of the presentation. So to begin with, I chose these two authors, Wicksell and Walras. Actually, Wicksell, 1934, that is the English translation. His original book, the lectures, were published in 1901 in Swedish, and then translated in 1934 upon suggestion of Lionel Robbins from the LSE. And of course, I take into account the fourth edition of Walras' Elements of Pure Economic Theory, published in 1900, but the first English translation was ready in 1954. Anyway, so sorry for this. This little bit mistaken way of cite these two works, but Wicksell is 1901 and Walras is 1900. Anyway, the idea is that both authors, despite the common understanding of, in general in economics, that it is normally more frequently to regard only Walras as the general equilibrium theorist. However, Wicksell also developed a general equilibrium model based on the neoclassical forces of supply and demand and the principle of factor substitution. Why we call it general equilibrium? Basically because unlike the approach followed by Alfred Marshall, who developed the so-called partial or particular equilibrium method, although we can discuss Marshall later on if you want. In Marshall, you have to keep at bay some variables in order to focus your attention on the problem at hand. For example, the equilibrium price in a certain market. So you take as given or constant what happens in other markets, but there are a lot of methodological problems also there. But in any case, the general equilibrium approach means that we have to take into account all the economic variables and the interrelationships between themselves and the effects, different effects that we can disentangle in one market from what happened in other markets, right? And that is why the general equilibrium encompasses the consumption goods, the capital goods production, the production of consumption goods as well, the distribution of income, and the reinvestment of the surplus of the economy into new investment in order to keep some pace of capital accumulation. These are sort of more long-run problems, but I would say that both authors, but also other neoclassical authors, were very much concerned about the long-term tendencies of capital accumulation. But the first part of their analysis was always focused. If you go through the different works, you will see that always the first part of their contributions and books and works deal with some sort of static way of putting things together. And once they get more or less firm ground on which they base how they derive prices, output, and all these things, then they move towards more long-term issues of capital accumulation, for example, and all that, right? So to move sort of more dynamic framework. Okay, I didn't show you all the equation for general equilibrium model of these two authors because I mean we would have to go through a lot of slides and but I mean if you are interested, I have all the files opened in my computer and I can share all the. But what I want to mention right now is that. Both authors had a divergent view on how to treat the factor of production, which we normally call it capital. Okay, so how to treat capital formally in their models. Okay, and I mean I'm not introducing this issue of capital because I am going to talk about the controversies in capital theory. Of course, it has a bearing on that, but this issue of the treatment of capital was much earlier raised than in the period of the Cambridge controversies in the 1950s and 60s. It was raised at the turn of the 20th century. It was then raised once again in the 1930s in the debates between Nicholas Calder again, Hayek, and other authors, Frank Knight, for example, right? So this issue, this treatment, these problems around how to treat capital were already put forward by the early probably the second generation of neoclassical theorists, I would say, von Warburg, then Hayek, Knight, and so on. So this question of the treatment of capital has always been sort of simmering in the I would say even in the very period of formation of the neoclassical approach. So if we move already to the point number 2 on this problem of capital, we may first of all distinguish how these two authors viewed the factor of capital and how they approach the construction of their models and how they took up capital within their models, within their theories. Okay. First thing, Wicksell conceived capital in value terms. That is the first thing I would like to say. However, as we will see shortly, of course, he doesn't have any. He doesn't entertain any concept or notion of aggregate production function whatsoever. I mean, there is no aggregate production function. Okay. In fact, Wicksell determines in his, general equilibrium model the different heterogeneous capital goods endogenously, right? Whereas he has to conceive capital in value when capital is introduced among the data of the theory, right? So just to recap the basic frame of the neoclassical theory, the theory has to take as data the endowment of the factor of production, let's say land, for example, or natural resources, labor, and capital. Okay, so the economy has some endowment of these factors of production. The other group of data is the tastes and preferences of the consumers in order to derive the utility functions and eventually a demand which will establish the quantity of consumption goods being produced. And the third group of data regards the method of production, all right, the different techniques that are at the disposal of the entrepreneurs and firms in order to produce both consumption goods and capital goods. Okay, so the problem is how to treat capital amongst the data of the theory for Wicksell, because he didn't have any problems in terms of determining the heterogeneous capital goods, okay, by his system of equilibrium. Okay, indeed, that quotation shows a clear awareness on the part of Wicksell that capital has sort of two aspects, right? On the one hand, it has a physical aspect or a technical aspect, okay? And on the other hand, it has a sort of value aspect. So capital includes, he says, raw materials and other commodities which must be saved up. This, of course, is the commonly accepted sense of the term. all these different capital goods have only one quality in common, namely that they represent certain quantities of exchangeable value, so that they may be regarded as a single sum of value, a certain amount of the medium of exchange, money. So the idea basically is that these two aspects are very important to bear in mind when we try to understand the neoclassical theory, because there is, let's say again, a technical point of view. Capital includes different raw materials, different capital goods, different stuff, but at the same time, from the perspective of the saver or the investor or the entrepreneur who wants to invest money, they will take into account the capital goods as a sort of representation of value of money, right? Because the people will be interested in doing the math on how much the profit rate, how much profit will be drawn from that investment in value terms, independently whether the investor put the money in, I don't know, a loom, a tractor, or in a company's share in the stock market, etc. Okay, so again, Wicksell, interestingly, and this was a common feature of these traditional authors like Leon Walras as well, he didn't limit himself to count the number of equations and the number of unknown variables and then concluded that the equilibrium was reached and so on and so forth, right? So indeed, what Wicksell actually tried very painstakingly, I would say, to show is that in order to determine a long period equilibrium or a sort of persistent position of rest of the system, we need a sort of inverse relationship or inverse function between the rate of interest, as is normally called in the neoclassical theory, the rate of profit, and the demand for capital or the employment curve of capital. Okay, and so this has to be this had to be shown by the system independently or despite the illegitimacy of conceiving capital in value among the data of the theory. Okay, so this is an important piece of information because it was clear to Wicksell and to many others traditional neoclassical scholars that conceiving of capital in value terms was illegitimate. Okay, we cannot measure one of the elements in the data of the theory in value terms because the theory has also to determine prices and distributive variables. So basically the theory would end up in a sort of circular reasoning, right? Because I am taking as data something which depends on the variable that the theory has to determine. But Wicksell was aware of that, as were von Baberg, Knight, and many other, Marshall, as many other theories. But the thing is that the most important part was that Wicksell wanted to derive this downward slope in demand curve for the factor of production. Okay, so that was the basic issue. Okay, the question is, if you go to the part of the volume 1 of Wicksell's lecture, you will see that he goes through at length on how to derive this inverse demand curve for factor of production, in particular for capital, right? And again, he grounded that analysis on the principle of factor substitution. Again, as I have recalled it in the previous lecture, this idea of an inverse relationship between the rate of interest and the quantity of capital employed, or if you want, between the wage rate and the quantity of labor employed. Okay, this is the idea of the factor substitution. And let me put it very briefly, this principle of factor substitution, so that we can understand Wicksell a little bit more. And the idea is basically that there is, for some reason, let's say, by relying on some, technicians' knowledge or engineers' knowledge, however, we have knowledge, or we know that there is, or we can classify different techniques of production, okay, according to their more or less intensity of the use of the different factor of production, right? For example, if you remember, you might remember or recall some aspect of von Baberg's approach regarding this average period of production, for example, right? Those more roundabout processes vis-a-vis those less roundabout processes, right? Meaning the former more capital intensive process because they need more rounds of production, more raw materials or more capital goods in their production in order to get to the consumption good, rather than the less roundabout process which required less quantity of raw material or less time waiting. For example, if you are producing champagne, for example, and you have to put the grapes for a while in deposit and all that. So this idea of more or less roundabout processes was somehow picked up by Wicksell from von Baberg. However, Wicksell departed from von Baberg on some respects regarding the interest rate, but the chief idea here is that for the economy, there is a number of techniques that can be a priori classified according to their relative intensity in the use of the factor of production. That was the key assumption here. And Wicksell tried to show that analytically, right? And he says that an increase in the capital available in the economy, so the capital per labor in the economy is increased, must itself, apart from simultaneous technical invention, this is another issue, right? So apart from that, will reduce the marginal productivity of saved up resources. So saved up resources means capital, okay? So an increase in capital will reduce the rate of interest. The marginal productivity of capital is the rate of interest, and therefore will increase the marginal productivity of the current resources, namely the other factor of production, labor or land being used today. So, and yet, if you read the Wicksell's passages, he actually is very unwilling to write, I would say, or to recognize that in order to close all his system, he has to assume among the data capital in value terms, all right? And the idea is that despite that, however, we can formally derive a proper downward sloping demand curve for capital and, of course, for labor in parallel, okay? And why is it so? Because there was a sort of methodological concern on these traditional neoclassical authors. And this was the idea that the theory has to determine some sort of uniform rate of profit or uniform rate of interest, right? That idea, this traditional idea, which came from Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and all the classical authors. And this feature was also, in my opinion, very much shared by the founding fathers and the first generations of neoclassical scholars, okay? It was this device of conceiving capital in value terms among the data at the same time that it allowed for an endogenous determination of the physical form of the capital, which eventually determine a uniform rate of interest and profit. That is why the core of the neoclassical theorists, of traditional neoclassical theorists, adopted more or less that approach in their treatment of capital. Okay, so we have some characteristics of this long period or persistent forces of equilibrium, which were shared between the classical and neoclassical theories like Wicksell, and the persistence of variables, the idea of the center of gravitation of the theoretical variables, and this bearing between the theory and the empirical evidence, okay? Still, capital has to be taken in value terms among the data, and this is an illegitimate procedure in any case. Okay, so and the theory of capital, and the neoclassical theory still, move on their in its research agenda, in its dissemination and all that, despite of that illegitimacy, because still the theory was able to show that the system somehow determined a long period equilibrium with a uniform rate of interest. This idea, I mean, we can go through many citations and quotations from other traditional authors like Alfred Marshall here, but also you find the same sort of agreement on that method on many other neoclassical authors like Clark, for example. Hicks in 1932 in his theory of wages, Pigou, many other authors. Okay, but not the case for Walras. Okay, so what happened with Walras? Walras treated capital differently from the treatment that we have just discussed in Wicksell and others. Okay, the thing is that Walras took as given among the data for the theory the heterogeneous capital goods vector that the economy has. All right, so and this treatment of capital actually prevents a determination of the uniform rate of interest or profit. And indeed, Walras was aware of that problem. That is why you will notice that in the 4th edition of the Elements, he actually changed some formal aspect of he added inequality signs in his system of general equilibrium for capital goods production, because he actually found that the system may end up by not being able to determine a uniform rate of interest. Okay. However, it is important to recognize that Walras did indeed share with his fellow neoclassical economists at that time the traditional concept of a long period equilibrium as a sort of persistent position of rest of the system, right? But the thing is that there was a sort of contradiction, an inner contradiction in Walras between his methodological view on the equilibrium as a sort of persistent resting point or long period point, and the treatment of capital in his general equilibrium model, because that treatment of capital prevented the general equilibrium model developed by Walras from achieving a uniform rate of interest or profit on the capital good. Of course, we could have even shown that. In mathematical terms with some sort of examples. I mean, if you are interested, I can show you other slides on that problem if you want. But that is more or less the belief in my historical reconstruction for the time being. But don't believe in what I am saying very deeply, because you have to double check what I am trying to say here. Sorry. And so this is a rather lengthy quotation by Walras to justify why I think he was sharing the view on the normal positions or normal states or long period equilibrium of the general equilibrium system, despite that his own system was not able to determine a characteristic of this long period position, as I will show you later on. And he says in the 4th edition of his book, it never happens in the real world that the selling price of any product is absolutely equal to the cost of the productive services that enter into that product, or that the effective demand and supply of services or products are absolutely equal. Yet, equilibrium is the normal state, in the sense that it is the state towards which things spontaneously tend under a regime of free competition in exchange and in production. So his general equilibrium system does not only cover exchange or pure exchange, but also production, both of consumption goods and capital goods, right? So he is dealing with that problem. And what he's saying here is, I mean, it never happens that the demand price and supply price are actually exactly the same, but there is a sort of tendency towards that level, right? That is the idea of a center of gravitation and all that we know from Adam Smith, or since Adam Smith onwards. Okay, and we have historical evidence as well that that is precisely why, or this may help explain why is it that Walras didn't have very much influence apart from Pareto and a few other scholars from Italy and France and Switzerland, I suppose. But during his active years, right, at the turn of the 20th century, and indeed the highest level of influence, or when Walras' work started to have some influence in the discipline, was in the 1930s, right, after the work of Hicks. But there were some works before Hicks in 1939, of course, like von Hayek in 1928 and Lindell in 1937, that adopted this Walrasian treatment of capital, right? But still, if you look into different branches of the neoclassical theory in Europe and in the US, just taking those two geographical regions, you will notice that at that time, at least until the 1930s and 40s, Walras didn't have much of an influence in other authors, right? So this, in a sense, I think that this somehow is explained by the fact of this contradiction which we have just mentioned, namely this contradiction between his treatment of capital as a heterogeneous set or vector of capital goods and the goal of determining a uniform rate of interest and therefore a long period or persistent equilibrium. The influence of Walras then changed radically and increased very rapidly after the 1940s and 1950s, and in particular, I would argue, after the so-called controversies in the capital theory between the two schools of thought, Cambridge and Cambridge, in the 1950s and 60s. But as I will try to show you shortly, this influence of Walras actually departed from Walras's own theoretical and methodological interest. Okay, actually, that is why we call them neo-Walrasian models of intertemporal and temporal general equilibrium, developed by Arrow, Debré, Malinvaud, Hicks himself, Bliss, Hahn, and many other neo-Walrasian scholars. So, this is probably, in my opinion, I think that one of the most important outcomes of the theoretical conflict in neoclassical theory between these two schools of thought during the Cambridge controversies, right? The transformation, radical transformation of the neoclassical theory. And I will go through that later on, shortly, But so this, in order to assess or appraise this transformation in the neoclassical theory in terms of equilibrium notion, expectations, and the treatment of capital, we have to somehow revisit some results of the Cambridge capital controversies, which I hadn't mentioned in the previous lecture, because in the previous lecture, I focused exclusively on a branch of the critics, namely Sean Robinson and other post-Keynesians. So let me move on to this part, and I will try to show you these, very briefly somehow, these outcomes and implications of the Cambridge controversies around the theory of capital for the neoclassical theory during this period of the 1950s and 1960s, and even I would say the early 1970s, okay? So, what is the issue in the controversies? When you look, let's just sort of recall of the importance of this theoretical conflict in the theory. It is, I would say, or I would argue, it has been much of a very important conflict in the neoclassical theory once you realize that such big names on the neoclassical side, like, for example, Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Joseph Stiglitz, historian of thoughts, historian of economic thought like Mark Blau, and many other neoclassical-oriented scholars got into this controversy actively. They took part actively into these debates. And I would say, in particular, I would mention two of them, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, in the very early period of this controversy in the 1950s and early 60s, and then Christopher Bliss and Frank Hunt in a later period of these controversies. But still, Paul Samuelson, I would even argue that 1 or 2 years before his death, he still debated these issues. So what is underlying the problems debated in this controversy was actually not that whether capital is measured in value or not. That was evident. That was evident, and scholars like Wicksell and others were aware of this issue. Von Baber, for example, right? So the actual issue was how we somehow try to found these downward sloping demand curves, right? More or less robustly, okay, for the factor of production. Factor of production covering capital, labor, land, and all these things. So that was the basic issue. In other words, what the Cambridge controversies unveiled was that the principle of factor substitution, the one that was generalized after Ricardo by the neoclassical authors in order to explain distribution according to the marginal productivities of each of them, was totally totally unrobust, or was not accurate to use for reproducible means of production, namely for capital. Okay, so the idea is that the principle of factor substitution is incorrect in order to understand the tendencies or dynamics of market economies, where we at least have two capital goods. Okay, so this is more of formal stuff. I won't get into the details of this mathematical representation, but namely, it's what I want to show you by this is basically the first two equations, right? So this is a system of production of one consumption good and one capital good for different techniques of production, right? So PA is the price of the consumption good and PC is the price of the capital good. And these prices are determined by the cost of production of both of them, the quantity of labor times the wage and the capital good needed for both the consumption and the capital good itself. Okay, anyway, if you are interested in that, I will be very happy and glad to discuss with you further. But the thing here is to show you that out of this analysis, combining the techniques of production, namely these technical coefficients, LC, LA, CC, and CA that you can see in this sort of matrix, you combine these technical coefficients and you put them into the prices, right? Because you need these coefficients in order to determine the cost, okay? And out of all this, basically, we can draw the relationship between the wage rate and the profit rate or interest rate, and therefore we can value capital, okay, in relationship with the rate of interest. In that case, when we have this sort of technique, so the shape of this curve is given by the technical coefficients, okay? And if we have these sort of techniques, then the capital value will increase as the rate of interest increases. So that case goes against the neoclassical theory. But we can have other two situations. When the technical data gives us a straight line, like the one you have on the left-hand side of the slide, then the value of capital doesn't change as the rate of interest changes. And on the right-hand side, you see that the capital employed in the economy will decrease if the rate of interest increases. So that would be the neoclassical case. Okay, so but the thing is that we can have any of these situations. We can have this one or these two. So we can end up eventually, in something like this, where we have two techniques, alpha and beta, right? And the combination of these two techniques for different distributive situations will lead us to choose for some values of distribution, the technique alpha, for some other values, the technique beta, and for some other values still, the technique alpha. So if you translate the left-hand side plot graph to the right-hand side one, the right-hand side one is a classical demand curve for capital and supply curve for capital, right? So you have a vertical supply curve. Let's say we take as given as quantity of value of capital, a vertical line, but then we may have this sort of demand for capital function or curve where we can see at least two equilibrium points, one of them being stable, the other one not stable, right? So, and what the controversies showed out of this probably two mathematical analysis is that we cannot, let's go back to Wicksell, we cannot actually classify the different techniques of production a priori according to different intensities in the use of the factor of production. So, for example, whatever the unit of measurement you choose, for example, if you believed in the very beginning that the technique alpha was more capital intensive because it was chosen for relatively low values of the rate of interest, right? So let's assume that the rate of interest is somewhere between 0 and R1. So you choose technique alpha. That's good. Then if the rate of interest increases and goes over R1, then we will choose technique beta, which is less capital intensive. Okay, so it is more labor intensive because the rate of interest is higher, therefore the wage rate is lower and labor intensive techniques will be optimal. However, after R2, lowercase R2, after that, again, we have an increase in the rate of interest, but the technique that I had classified as a more capital intensive technique is being chosen again for higher values of the rate of interest. So whatever the unit of measurement you choose for this classification of different techniques of production, you may end up in a contradiction with respect to what you have classified in the first instance. Okay, that is I would say, or at least that is my understanding, that is what the controversies have shown. And indeed, this result, oh, sorry, I have some, and this result actually was even acknowleded by neoclassical authors such as, for example, Paul Samuelson. Okay, this aspect of these results in the controversies were known as the reswitching of techniques and reverse capital deepening. And what these results show is that the principle of factor substitution is undermined, right? So the very premise of the neoclassical approach in order to draw demand curves is undermined, right? And so Again, let me tell you one more thing, because there has always been, at least since Wicksell's book, some doubts and some, misgivings around how to derive these demand curves. Indeed, Wicksell struggled a lot to show that, right? But I would say that the mathematical tools perhaps were yet not available to show very clearly that relationship between techniques of production in a sort of input-output matrices, for example, and the relationship between prices and distribution for different techniques being chosen. And that is why I would argue the problem was not envisaged before by, for example, Wicksell. But if you go through the literature in the 1930s of Frank Knight or Hayek, even Ava Lerner had contributed in those early debates in the 1930s, and Nicholas Kaldor, they had some sort of understanding that there was some problem there, right? Not surprisingly, these results in the controversies are also known in the literature as the so-called positive or negative Wicksell effects. You can call it Wicksell price effect or Wicksell real effect, whatever, right? The idea is that when you have changes in distribution, you will change your capital labor employed in the economy, and this may lead to a neoclassical way or to a neoclassical dynamic, in terms that if the rate of interest fell, then the quantity of capital will be increased. That would be a sort of negative price Wicksell effect, but you may have a positive price Wicksell effect where an increase in the interest rate will lead to an increase in the capital per worker, and not the other way around as the neoclassical theory had put it. Okay, so the question is now, what happened after these controversies and after this even acknowledgement on the part of some neoclassical authors, such as, for example, Paul Samuelson, and even Robert Solow as well, probably in the late 1960s, in particular in a series of contributions in 1966, organized by the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the famous Symposium on Paradoxes in Capital Theory, which was sort of organized by Samuelson and Piero Sraffa, although Sraffa didn't take part in that symposium and the Quarterly Journal of Economics, but Sraffa had correspondence with Samuelson around how to organize the symposium, how to gather the articles by Pasinetti, Garignani, Morishima, Samuelson himself with Levari and other authors as well. And so it was very much debated, this. And despite the fact, I mean, I am trying to convey you a sort of wrap-up idea of what happened after this controversy. But if we look at what happened or what the neoclassical theory looked like after this controversy, you would say, well, actually, neoclassical theory remained still as the mainstream of economic theorizing. I mean, you may even say that the economic theory, the neoclassical economic theory, got through this theoretical conflict, and eventually it survived and still is the dominant approach in both pure theory and empirical approach, with a lot of new elements and so on and so forth, right? But if you go to the core, I mean, the neoclassical theory is still the dominant approach by and large, I would say. And yet, however, we have to recognize one salient feature of this, and that is where Walras comes in. And that is when the neo-Walrasian models come in. And there is a new, let's say, transformation, in a new phase of the neoclassical, of the recent history of neoclassical economics, which is this not only emergence, because the emergence of the neo-variation models were in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, right? But after these controversies in the 1960s and more rapidly in the 70s, these neo-variation models of intertemporal and temporal general equilibrium took center stage, I would say. And this, yes, we have this, so we have time. This, I would argue, is, well, if we examine this new transformation of neoclassical theory, this is perhaps the first step in a sort of understanding why is it that, in my opinion, the neoclassical theory is in a sort of limbo or schizophrenic behavior when the theory has to propose or try out explanations both to pure theoretical problems and empirical problems, right? I am going to talk about that shortly, namely because in order to overcome the theoretical problems of the raised in the Cambridge controversies, the neoclassical theory relied on these neo-variation models of intertemporal and temporal general equilibrium. Namely, let's treat the capital as the variation way, as a heterogeneous vector of the capital goods, and I don't care about the uniformity of the rate of interest or rate of return, okay? That was the way out. Sorry. That was the way out of on the part of the neoclassical theory, at least when we examined the pure theory attempts at founding some sort of general framework, right? There are a lot of problems around these models, general equilibrium, intertemporal, temporary general equilibrium models. And there are problems from the side of the assumptions. There are problems from the side of the how many agents in consumption, how many consumers we have to take into account. There are methodological problems around what an intertemporal general equilibrium means actually. Because in the intertemporal setting, all transactions happen at an instant of time, at the very first instant of the first period of time. And then once you get that equilibrium variables, then you will have to use those values for the following exchanges and decisions on production and distribution and so on and so forth. So basically, for example, let's take a very, very basic intertemporal setting where you kind of this sort of, you can decide, for example, all the production from now onwards, right, for the future. All right, let's assume that for any number of months or years. The thing is that if you decide that, for example, technique 1 is the most appropriate or the most optimal one to choose, you are also assuming that in the future there will not be any, for example, technological innovation or technical changes or whatever. So, I mean, this framework even has to assume that you will know the future. Then they have to change. Then they change that somehow by adding the conditional development or conditional future, right? Because you can add some probabilities. Okay, so basically, I decide that I will exchange 3 kilograms of bread at $3 in 1 month's time. Okay, that would be conditional to if it rains or it doesn't rain at that time in that city, and that will lead us to another price and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of methodological problems. Sorry if I stopped here for too long. So back to the more formal aspects. So basically the position is I don't care about this uniformity of the rate of interest. And even I don't care if I change the original Walras's take on the method, on the way that he shared with his peers the this position of the long period equilibrium or persistent position of rest, as Marshall, Wicksell, and many others. Okay, so and this was a very radical transformation, right? This was a radical transformation in the theory, basically because not in the formal aspect that the capital is taken among the data as the heterogeneous vector of capital goods, because that was already present in Walras, but the radical change, I think, regards the change in what that equilibrium that these models may determine mean, actually. What is the meaning of this new equilibrium, right? And this was raised already in the 1970s, and so on and so forth, but this methodological debate didn't develop very much, I would say, and there were different attempts to re-engage scholars around what happened with these intertemporal general equilibrium, for example, to discuss these methodological issues. But of course, there are, opposing point of view regarding that. But still, I think that on the one hand, the neoclassical theory tried to overcome this criticism on these formal aspects, and somehow they have overcome that because they relied on this variation capital and they developed these intertemporal and temporal general equilibrium models. But when they have to, when you go through any top economics journal and you look into some empirical or applied work in economic growth or whatever, then you see that investment, for example, or employment, macroeconomic issues, for example, then you realize that the versions of the neoclassical theory which is being used for empirical work still is the traditional one, which has to regard capital as a magnitude in value terms among the data, right? So, and even aggregate production functions and all these things. So it looks like sort of that the theory shows on the one hand a pure theoretical approach based on this intertemporal general equilibrium framework, and on the other, it still uses the traditional approach, right? So in order to discuss further these methodological problems, let me compare these two meanings between, on the one hand, the long period or persistent position of rest of the system against the temporal general equilibrium meaning, okay? And eventually, hopefully, probably it will shed some light on this radical transformation of the theory. So the long run or long period equilibrium features regards, on the one hand, that the equilibrium as a center of gravitation of the empirical variables must be included in the explanation of provided by the theory, namely the mechanisms that explain any out of equilibrium position to come back to the equilibrium position must be included in the theory itself. So basically, the supply and demand functions play that role, okay? Play the role of providing the mechanisms in order to guarantee that out of equilibrium positions may go back to the equilibrium position or to a new position of equilibrium. That is why we need stability. The second feature regards that the equilibrium positions that the theory determine must be persistent enough so that they can determine the trend or average of the empirical magnitude without being affected by accidental or disequilibrium phenomena. Okay, so that is the idea that we saw in Walras's quotation, namely, it never happens that supply price is equal to demand price, but there is a tendency towards that. And the fact that demand price doesn't match supply price in a single market, for example, that won't affect the equilibrium being established. And the other two features of the long period equilibrium notion regards that for the case of capital goods, as already discussed, these capital goods have to yield a uniform rate of return or interest or profit, and the composition has to be endogenously determined, like the case of Wicksell. But in order to get to the feature number 3, we need feature number 4, namely that capital has to be taken in value terms among the data. Okay, the difference or some of the differences against the temporary general equilibrium regard some aspects that I am going to talk now. So the idea, differently from the long period conception, is that the temporary general equilibrium is conceived as being a sort of fixed point or market nudge equilibrium where firms, on the one hand, maximize the expected profit, households, on the other hand, maximize utility, and there is some sort of arbitrage condition in order to establish the uniformity on the demand prices of the capital goods. But interestingly, and unlike the traditional versions of the neoclassical theory, the mechanisms of convergence towards some notion of equilibrium are not part of the equilibrium concept itself. So I don't care whether the equilibrium, for example, is stable or not. I don't care whether if we have even shorter than temporary situation, this equilibrium situation in any market. I don't care about how to put that position back to equilibrium, right? There is no mechanism into the explanation of how equilibrium comes about in the temporary and also in the intertemporal general equilibrium approach. The evolution of the economy in the temporal general equilibrium. This is the framework first developed by Hicks in 1839, right? So the period of time, the Hicksian week, right? Week after week, there is a sort of sequence of equilibria or equilibrium weeks, right? And the economy would, the evolution of the economy can be studied by this sequence of different equilibrium. But this single equilibrium point would be very short term. Not surprisingly, in pure theoretical models, the economy has to be assumed to be always in equilibrium, right? And that is why the models have to have resort to the auctioneer, right? We cannot have adjustment in real time, okay? And the disequilibrium only takes place in logical time, but not in real time, right? Why? Because if we admit for this equilibrium to take place, then there is no warranty in the formal model to go to some new equilibrium or to the old equilibrium, because there is no real time by definition in those models. So the variables defining this equilibrium must be dated, right? So you have the endowments, labor in week 1, labor in week 2, and the same for the capital goods of the type 1 in week 1, and so on and so forth, right? So you have to date the different endowment, and again, another methodological problems. We have to introduce some expectations on the part of the agents here. And again, we have to assume that are these agents having the same expectation functions? Are they homogeneous? Are they not? Right? So another methodological problem. Indeed, if you go, we have time, yeah. If you go to neoclassical authors of the caliber of the Sonnenschein, Mantel, and De Breu himself, they showed in the 1970s in different works that for intertemporal general equilibrium models, you actually have to assume one consumer. You cannot even assume two consumers, okay? Because you need somehow, or either you assume they have a homogeneous utility functions, or you have to assume one single consumer for a general equilibrium framework. And well, you have that theoretical result as well, which actually undermines the methodology of these new variation constructs, okay? Of course, these temporary general equilibrium models or intertemporal general equilibrium models don't don't have any. I mean, they are not compatible with the condition of a uniform rate of interest or profit on the capital goods, a feature or characteristic which was traditional to the founding fathers of neoclassical theory, as well as the classical political economists. Interestingly, Frank Hahn in the early 70s acknowledged that contemporary general equilibrium theory makes no formal or explicit causal claims at all. Namely, the general equilibrium theory, the intertemporal general equilibrium approach, doesn't provide any explanation, causal explanation as to how equilibrium comes about, right? So it looks like that these new approaches, new models, are concerned on the determination of a fixed point of prices and quantities on the one hand, and on the other hand, the stability analysis, the study of how the mechanisms bringing about the equilibrium have no necessary relationship to the first one, right? So it's looked like we are treating two isolated phenomena, whereas traditionally, in the neoclassical approach, Walras, Wicksell, Marshall, even Hicks himself, these two aspects of the problem of equilibrium determination were put together because the theory, that was the idea, should provide the explanation of the mechanisms that out of equilibrium positions will be back to an equilibrium resting point or to a new equilibrium. Okay. So, as a way of, not conclusion, of course, but as a way of putting some discussion here, this neo-variation equilibrium actually has some features like they are not persistent, again, because of this specification of the capital goods. That is why these models have to rely on this auctioneer, okay, because otherwise time-consuming adjustment will cause path dependence and the equilibrium could end up in any position, actually, and eventually there might be indeterminacy of the equilibrium. Indeed, because of this dissatisfaction with the auctioneer, namely that all exchanges in the market have to take place through an auctioneer, it's quite of a strong assumption. Then in pure theory, most of these models have to assume equilibrium, actually, rather than explaining how equilibrium is brought about. So the focus in pure theory is on the existence of equilibrium. That is where Kakutani's or Brouwer fixed points demonstrations come in. Okay, so basically it is a mathematical problem to determine by relying on topology analysis, for example, and all that things, the fixed point of equilibrium, so the existence of equilibrium. But that is a purely mathematical and formal problem. There is no, I mean, in my opinion, there is no information on or relationship as to if we want to somehow use that theoretical knowledge or information into some understanding of empirical or a real economy. Okay, so that is I mean, another methodological problem. I mean, to what extent we can trust this theory in order to understand market economies trends, because the assumptions are very strong and still some of the problems are very strong. For example, we may end up with this zero income problem in general equilibrium frameworks. So, and again, as a way of concluding now, if we have some minutes left, the time frame of this equilibrium notion in neo-variation models is very short at best. Okay, so we don't have any persistent characteristic on the part of the variables in equilibrium, and that is big, and that would be showing a sort of poor guide to understand real economies, and therefore poor guide as well to economic policy. Again, the price that was paid in order to save the neoclassical theory out of all these theoretical conflict in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s was very high, because the economics discipline saved the mainstream or the neoclassical theory, but the price was very high because, whether or to what extent we can use these new developments, new models for a better understanding of market economies. Not surprisingly, that is something that I already mentioned. The empirical work still relies on the traditional versions. Mainstream empirical work, still relies on these traditional versions, which were undermining the controversy. Again, you may jump in and say, oh, but nowadays the mainstream had incorporated other assumptions, other branches, even other insight from other social sciences. Yes, for example, behavioral economics or neuroscience, cognitive studies, all those things. Again, yes, that's true, but once you realize the sort of assumptions or insights coming from other disciplines, then you realize that they have the mainstream theories have to rely on non-orthodox ways of approaching the things that the theory used to approach by relying on those supply and demand mechanism, right? For example, if you take into account behavioral economics or neuroscience in order to explain trends in consumptions in a certain economy for certain social groups, for example, well, that speaks of the fact that the neoclassical utility and demand theory was totally incapable of explaining that, because the assumptions of utility functions and demand curves are very strong and don't have any bearing to the real thing, right? Even when you construct utility function, you write U, the utility function is a function of the quantities being consumed, but not of the prices. However, you may even look around and say that for some social groups and for some commodities or goods, it is the case that some people find some sort of higher utility or satisfaction by purchasing expensive stuff, right? Because of a social demonstration within their groups. I want to buy a castle in Scotland. I can live elsewhere, but I want that castle because of what? Because, well, I am showing something out of that. But that cannot be dealt with by the neoclassical theory, interestingly, because you wouldn't end up in mathematical mingle. Sorry if I extended, I ran the time, but I can stop here.